Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Very excited about this webinar on the theory and practice of transparent qualitative health research, and I'll be introducing our presenters in 2 seconds. Just to go over some of the go-to webinar menu options. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see an orange box with a white arrow. If you click on the white arrow, it opens up the menu. First of all, feel free to type in questions at any time. We'll take questions at the end, but you can type them in at any time. Everyone's on mute just so you can hear the presenters. And we are recording this, so you'll get a recording probably sometime next week in an email from us. And we also have the PowerPoint handout. So if you see the handout section, you can open that and just download the handout, which is great. So with that, I will get started. So first off, my name's Stacy Penna. I'm the NVivo Community Director here at QSR International, and I've been working with Ali from Sage with these webinar series. So I'll let Ali introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Ali Owen and I'm the commissioning editor for Sage's research methods books based out of our London office. So I love getting to work with Stacy and all of our presenters on this very global and very timely series.
Thank you very much. And now for the presenters, I just wanted to introduce them and then I'll be handing over the PowerPoint control to them. So first off, Lori Forthworth. She's a senior research associate at Guttmacher Institute. Her work focuses on abortion and contraceptive use in the United States and the use of qualitative methods in public health research. And Sebastian Karcher, who's Associate Director of the Qualitative Data Repository at Syracuse University. His main interests are in qualitative data management, data curation, and the integration of technology into scholarly workflows. And Jennifer Moeller, who's a research associate at the Guttmacher Institute, and her research interests include sexual behavior, contraceptive use, and access to sexual and reproductive health services. So thank you all for being here. And I'm going to make Sebastian the presenter. So just give me 2 seconds.
All right, let me get the right side of the presentation. I think this is the correct order now, right?
Yes, you're good to go. Thank you.
Laurie, take it away.
Yeah. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lori Forthworth, Senior Researcher at the Guttmacher Institute, as Stacy said. We're a nonprofit based in New York that does research on sexual and reproductive health in the US and internationally. We're best known for surveillance and basic stats on abortion, contraception, and fertility intentions, but we also explore these issues with a variety of other methodologies as well to try to understand what's behind the numbers. We strive for reproducibility in our work like everybody else, but also for our own reasons. Working on these topics, which are extremely personal and politically charged, subjects us to a different level of scrutiny than some other researchers. Not only do we want to adhere to the changing expectations of the larger social science field, we also want to improve our internal processes to avoid mistakes and to make as much of our data as possible available for public use to demonstrate the integrity of our work and bolster our results. Exploring more complex questions has also involved expanding our qualitative work, which prompted questions for us about how to apply the concepts of reproducibility to qualitative inquiry. Sebastian Karcher, Associate Director of the Qualitative Data Repository and Research Assistant Professor of Political Science at Syracuse University, came to Guttmacher to give a talk about transparency in qualitative work and completely blew our minds. He'll be explaining what that means for you, and my colleague and I will present some case studies about how we've actually implemented this. I'll explain how we're applying the principles to a project for which data cannot be shared. And Jen Muller, Research Associate at Guttmacher, will tell everyone about her current project, which will be our very first attempt to make an abortion-related qualitative project transparent and publicly accessible. We hope to show you both the why and the how of doing open science in qualitative health research.
Thank you, Laurie. everyone is talking about open data, research transparency, right? You have journals talking about this, you have funders talking about this, you have governments talking about this. This is kind of my more European-heavy version of a slide with the EU and the UKRI and the NHS on there, but I could have the same slide Australia-centric or US-centric or Asia-centric. This is really a global topic. But why do we care about this so much? Well, first of all, being transparent about your research is just about being a good researcher. The way science works, it's really about the rules that we follow to get to knowledge. That's what makes science science. And making visible how we follow those rules, i.e. being transparent, is foundational to our scientific enterprise. It's also just about being a good colleague. If you share your data, if you share your materials, if you share your procedures, you allow others to scrutinize your work, but you also allow them to build on your work. And perhaps you'll be one of those people on one of those giants eventually on whose shoulders an entire new field can be built. It's also about being a good citizen, more broadly speaking. A lot of us got into whichever field of science, qualitative research we are in, to make a difference, to make an impact. And open science, transparent science is more inviting, allows more people in, and is in the end more impactful. Finally, there are not just carrots, altruistic motives, there's also sticks. Increasingly, scientific funding agencies expect you to be transparent about your work, and more journals expect you to have things like data availability statements, follow certain rules, be transparent about your work in order to get published. But you may be asking yourself, does this apply to me as a qualitative researcher? Can qualitative research really be transparent in a similar way? So is that appropriate? And even if I think generally speaking, this makes sense, but can it be done ethically? I work with humans and there are sensitive things that they tell me. Is it possible to do qualitative, transparent research ethically? And then there are lots of practicalities. You may be generally convinced, but there's so many details that you worry about. So the question is, can this actually be done? And one thing I think that may be going on is that a lot of the transparency discourse is shaped by quantitative templates. So this is an influential report in the US from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. That's 3 different national academies. And you notice their reproducibility and replicability in science, right? So where reproducibility is obtaining consistent results using the same input data and computational steps, and replicability is obtaining consistent results across studies aimed at answering the same scientific methods. So you do the same experiment or the same study multiple times. If you read this, does this really sound like qualitative research to you? It doesn't to me. What I want to argue is that whereas reproducibility and replicability may not apply to what we do, transparency typically does. In political science, where I come from, we think about transparency as made up of 3 different components. There is production transparency. How were your data generated, collected? How did you recruit, say, participants? How did you sample them? What were your questionnaires? What were your focus group guides? All those sorts of information. The second part is data access. Can you actually share components? Can you share the data that you used to get your conclusions? And finally, how were the data analyzed? What were the steps that you took from, say, to the transcripts to the concepts, or to your causal claims if you're making those? If you look at this in quantitative research, if you have the data and you have the analysis steps, typically codified in a computer program in statistical codes, you have reproducibility. But that's really just a byproduct of being transparent. What I think we actually care about is that transparency. And I want to do some kind of very high level, somewhat embarrassingly superficial philosophy of science to kind of drive that point home. If you think about epistemological spectrums, so kind of how we get to knowledge, how we as scientists think we get to knowledge, I think one way to think about this is kind of on a spectrum. On the right-hand side, you have positivism, the search for universal laws and causality, physics, right? Some social scientists believe this, right? Like they're strong positivists in their search for universal laws. And then all the way on the other hand, you have maybe some post-structural theories, people who really don't believe that intersubjective knowledge is all that achievable and that really only the author can understand their own data. What I would argue is that most of what we do as qualitative researchers falls somewhere in the middle, where we're in one way or the other interested in interpretation, in understanding, in verstehen, if you want the Weberian term. And if you're interested in that, we still want to be transparent, right? I want to show how my interpretations of the world that may be different from your interpretations of the world, but I want to be as clear as possible, as transparent as possible about how I get to those interpretations of the world. There's also, even if you're kind of towards the more positivist spectrum of the social scientific enterprise, if you think of the role of a lot of qualitative research in the kind of research cycle, a lot of us are more towards the left hand. Qualitative research may be done for exploration, it may be done for hypothesis generation, it may be done for theory building, it may be done for, in the case of Jen's research that you're going to hear about, improving measurements. All of those things don't necessarily replicate. We aren't really interested in replicating qualitative research most of the times. Some of the times we are, most of the times we aren't. But we definitely want to be transparent about how we get to our hypotheses, about the foundations upon which our theory is built, because everything else would lead to bad science and would ultimately be a waste of our and other people's time. Now ethics. Ethics is absolutely essential for all research involving human participants, but I would argue it's perhaps even more essential for us as qualitative researchers. And that's because of the close relationships and the relationships of trust that we often have with our participants. Even in kind of research where we are just, quote unquote, doing one-shot interviews, we often spend an hour with an individual participant. In other research settings, we build long-term relationships with them. And so we must take ethics, and we typically do take ethics very seriously. So one part of if you want to share your data is you need to talk about that with your participants. And Jen is going to talk about how a consent procedure looks like for asking about data sharing in sensitive research. You also, in most cases, will want to think about removing any identifying information, and that's possible, but it's not straightforward, right? It's easy to remove names, phone numbers, email addresses, those sorts of things, but you also have to think about contextual details that may be revealing. And in some cases, that's not enough. When transcripts are so rich or so unique that it's impossible to completely de-identify them, you may either not share them at all or restrict the access to them appropriately. Which brings me to the third part, secure storage. You may have noticed that I'm talking about de-identification and not about anonymization that you maybe more familiar with. One reason is that it's very hard to absolutely guarantee that you can never tell who someone behind the qualitative transcript is. We don't know where technology is going, those sorts of things. So where data are sensitive, making sure that they're stored securely and to regulate access to people who have an appropriate interest in those data is often a good way to make sure that we do justice to the trust that our participants place in us as researchers. Note, however, sometimes we can't share our data. Still, in those cases, if you think back a couple of slides, the production and the analytic transparency components of what we do are still possible, and Laurie is going to talk about that. Before I hand it over to her, I want to flag one more thing that we at QDR are very excited about, and that is sharing not just transcripts, but actually sharing coded data, so data from qualitative data analysis software. And this is, of course, an NVivo co-sponsored webinar, so this is particularly appropriate. Until recently, this was quite difficult because everyone had their own format. And now the makers of a lot of the big tools, so NVivo, Atlas, MaxQDA, Deduce, etc., have recently all agreed on a joint format that's referred to as Refuqda, where Refu stands for the Rotterdam Exchange Format Initiative. And that's really nice because now you have coded data in NVivo, you can send it to your colleague who prefers to work in Atlas TI. You've coded data in Deduce, you can share it with your students who may be using MaxQDA. But it's also really nice for research transparency because you can now share your coded data, including, depending on the nature of your work, things like memos that would help with production transparency, but also things like your full codebook with, or an NVivo note, with an NVivo's note descriptions, those sorts of things, in a format that other people can read in. We're not going to talk about this in practice very much because this is fairly new, and Jen and Laurie didn't implement this in their projects, but I wanted to flag it in case other people are interested, and we at QDR are very excited about this. And with that, over to you, Laurie.
Sebastian, thanks for walking us through the concept of transparency in qualitative research, for showing us how it's both appropriate and ethical for us to do our work this way, for explaining what's needed for data access, and for showing us how the software can start to fit into it all. I want to share what we've been working on that addresses the feasibility of making our data production and analysis transparent and potentially accessible. We developed a checklist to help researchers build what we're calling a transparency archive. And the goals of this are to help us follow the principles of transparency throughout the life cycle of our projects so that we could potentially share our data, to help us generate transparency related materials as we go, to document these activities for our future work, and to help us distinguish what's useful for internal documentation versus what's necessary to include in a public repository, because it would be useful to outsiders seeking to understand the project. So our checklist is basically a list of materials categorized by what stage of the project they refer to and indicating whether the MEN is useful just for internal documentation or important to include in a package of materials that you present in a public-facing forum. The items on the list were gathered from QDR's resources, from qualitative reporting checklists such as the Correct, and from our own experience and expertise. We have about 30 items on there right now, which sounds like a lot, but the vast majority of them are things that you would have anyway. Your final IRB materials, an overview of your methods of data collection, your node structure. This tool will remind you to do the necessary documentation. It'll help you determine whether these items could or should be shared. And by grouping these items together, it encourages you to see this documentation as a way to make your work transparent, that is comprehensible and defensible. There are also some items on the checklist that you might not be as familiar with, and still others that are going to be dependent on processes, such as consenting for data sharing, if you choose to do so. The project I've been working on for the last few years is a longitudinal analysis of people's experiences getting sexual and reproductive health care in a state that restricts how these services are paid for. So we've been looking at how people navigate barriers to this kind of care and what impacts those barriers have on them, particularly on their contraceptive strategies. It's a lot of data. 40 respondents and 3 waves of in-depth interviews. There are also a ton of analytic products apart from the interview transcripts themselves, structured memos for each respondent for each wave, plus a memo of each respondent's trajectory over time, point-in-time summaries of themes, plus matrices at both the respondent and summary level. Now, one of our partners in this project was not comfortable with the idea of us making these data available for public use. It's disappointing, but understandable. So does that mean that it's not worth it to try to do this project transparently? We judged that it was both possible and beneficial to strive for production and analytic transparency, even though our data would not be publicly accessible. And we used the transparency checklist to help us do that. We created all items on the list that were applicable to our project, and I'll go over a few that were crucial to attaining these kinds of transparency in our processes. To achieve production transparency, or to fully describe how our data were collected, we created a data management plan. Jen is going to go into this in greater detail, so I'm not going to describe exactly what it entails. I will say that although we've done scores of qualitative projects at Guttmacher over the years, we've never made a formal data management plan. Using the checklist prompted us to do so for this project, and I'm beyond thankful that we put thought into these structures and procedures at the outset, and that we had a dedicated place to document the many, many changes we made as we went along. Our analytic transparency is guided by another item, our analysis plan. This documents our research questions, our approach and theory, our plan for coding, matrix construction, and basic analysis. It also provides a narrative of the evolution of changes in all of these areas. Again, formally writing this out was a first for us, and again, it proved crucial. For example, especially when we had a long and contentious meeting about which respondents to include in our final data set, because not everyone completed all 3 waves of data collection. And then we nearly forgot what we decided because decisions hadn't been documented in a central location. These documents are now stored in an internal transparency archive, along with copies of all the data and analytic products that I mentioned before. The archive also includes a statement about data access in which we articulate why we can't make them publicly accessible. Our data use agreement forbids it. The checklist serves as a table of contents and a guide to this archive. Ours includes links to the location of all the items on our own network. Now, of course, none of these items are magical or even new, and many of them are ones that you're probably producing within the course of your work. The checklist and the resultant archive have been rather magical for us, though. They've forced us to document decisions that tend to get lost in the shuffle and to think more critically about the decisions that we do make. They've improved our project organization and workflow and have introduced us to items that were not previously a part of our qualitative practice. And when complete, it's going to help us in doing our qualitative work as transparently as possible. We've found this checklist and the items it produces to be absolutely worth it. And of course, the checklist itself is publicly available. The link is going to be on our last slide.
Okay, so thanks, Lori. Now I'll talk about how these concepts can be applied to another qualitative project that we conducted at Guttmacher. So as part of a large National Institutes of Health funded project investigating the quality and completeness of abortion reporting, we conducted cognitive interviews in 2 US states to test and refine survey question wording. We've been working with QDR to understand the process for sharing the study materials and data on their repository at the end of the study. And I'll walk through how we've used some of the previously mentioned tools, as well as share findings about respondents' consent to data sharing. While NIH is funding the larger study and the data collection effort, we're utilizing a different funding source for the work that we're doing to advance the reproducibility and transparency of our research. So we use the transparency checklist that Lori described for our project. Among its other uses, the checklist has functioned as a resource for documenting decisions regarding what materials we might share from the project. When going through the checklist, we paid extra attention to the sensitivity of our data and how that sensitivity impacts what we feel comfortable sharing, especially due to the stigma and sensitivity of abortion. In the notes column, we include reasons for why certain documents may not be shared. I'll talk in depth about it later, but we're planning to only share de-identified transcripts for some of our respondents based on their understanding of data sharing. We'll also be sharing things like the demographic file of respondents, the coding scheme with no descriptions, the analytic plan, and analytic memos. Additionally, we created a data management plan for the project. We adapted a checklist assembled by QDR, which outlines what should be addressed in a data management plan, such as practices and procedures used to organize data and keep it safe, the documentation that will be generated, and plans for sharing the data. In addition to keeping our processes transparent, the data management plan helps us think through how to prepare the data for being publicly shared. For example, by mapping out the various pieces of data that would be collected, we're able to pinpoint the places where we could avoid collecting identifying information, thereby protecting participants and making it easier to potentially share the data publicly. So, for example, we use a recruitment firm, so we never had access to participant contact information. Additionally, we use verbal consent, so the participants did not have to sign their name on the consent forms. However, a participant may have mentioned something that could be identifying in the interview, such as their partner's job or their child's name, which could maybe be traceable. When we cleaned the transcripts, we looked for this information and redacted anything that we found. Additionally, when we coded the data, we created a node called identifying, where we coded anything that still needed to be redacted that we found while reading through. In addition, while the content of our interviews centers on the participants' feedback on survey questions and not on their in-depth abortion story, some participants still provided details about their abortion experiences, referencing their friends and family or abortion access in their community. So for all interviews, it's critical to think about how much of the story would need to be redacted, or if demographic characteristics associated with the transcript can make it possible to identify someone. For when we share our study materials externally on QDR, we've come up with some access controls that QDR will implement to allow other researchers to access the data. So QDR will review their institutional affiliation, research plan, data management security plan, and commitment to destroy the data when done with it before granting access. So in the US, institutional review boards, or IRBs, are responsible for reviewing and approving research to protect the rights of human participants. For our study, we needed to describe to both our IRB and potential participants that their data might be shared with external researchers. So in the IRB protocol, we explained that we'll ask participants if they consent to allowing their data to be shared for future research purposes, and that this consent was optional. There was an additional consent to participate in the study. We also laid out the process for sharing data with QDR and implications for confidentiality. So we included information on how the data will be de-identified, how QDR handles sensitive data, that other researchers would apply for access to the data, and that Guttmacher could set that application standards that would allow access to the data. And on the screen is the language in the consent form that we used to explain the process of data sharing to participants, which we tried to make understandable at an 8th grade reading level. If they did not consent to data sharing, they could still be in the study. We had them mark their choice regarding data sharing and included their participant ID so we could keep track of who agreed or not. Because we're interested in how participants understand data sharing and how they decide whether to participate in data sharing, we followed up with participants at the end of each interview, asking them to reflect on the experience. In particular, we asked several open-ended questions to get their feedback on how the participants understood data sharing. We asked what they were thinking about when we discussed data sharing and how they made their decision to share or not. So we found that the vast majority of participants agreed to data sharing. Of those who did not consent to data sharing, respondents were from both states and both had and didn't have prior abortions. So we asked respondents what they were thinking about when we discussed data sharing. In retrospect, we should have asked them more explicitly to define data sharing. Many respondents had insufficient responses, meaning that they didn't provide a definition of data sharing or enough information for us to assess their understanding of the concept. But among those whose responses did include a description of data sharing, over half provided answers that demonstrated accurate understanding of the concept. So for example, this participant described data sharing as other people may be interested in the survey process that you guys did and could be helpful to them. So that's what I got from it, that it would be shared to other research people that needed answers to the questions that maybe they didn't do, but they would like the data, I guess, from it. However, the other half of the respondents who explained data sharing did not seem to have a very clear understanding, interpreting data sharing as participating in research or disseminating findings, despite our attempts to explain this during the consent process. So for example, this respondent said, when you mention the word data sharing, it could be an article with different points of view, no names, no nothing, but different points of view of the people that you've interviewed. So that's what I thought about. A magazine, a book, or what do you call those that they give you sometimes? Pamphlet, I think it's called. Something like that with opinions of women. As I mentioned earlier, we're not planning to share the de-identified transcripts for responses like these on QDR due to participants' inaccurate understanding and concerns that their consent to data sharing was not truly informed. We also looked at the motivations for data sharing. So the majority of respondents were motivated to agree to data sharing in order to help other people and/or improve research. 1/3 of participants who agreed to data sharing felt comfortable doing so as long as their name or other identifying information was not included. So this respondent said, when you said that my name wouldn't be attached to it, that made me more comfortable sharing my data. If it's gonna, help people understand more about abortions, why people do it and stuff like that, I would be happy to share. I would say even if my name was attached, I would maybe still share it if it were to help, but the fact that it's not attached made it easier to be like, okay, yeah, to say yes. And those who did not agree to data sharing were often concerned about the overall privacy and confidentiality of their responses. So this respondent said, I'm in the middle of wanting to share it and not wanting to share it. And I just don't, I don't know how the data is going to be used. And I just probably wouldn't want, in the long-term scenario, having it come back at me. So we've systematically analyzed participants' responses and submitted a manuscript with these results for publication. And we also uploaded a preprint of the paper on Soch Archive that you can check out. So our results about participants' understanding of and motivation for data sharing support the ideas that participants are likely to agree to qualitative data sharing. And the sensitivity of abortion leads us to believe that agreement is even more likely for less sensitive studies. However, respondents' misunderstanding of the data sharing consent is concerning. And so to attempt to remedy this, we recommend using a tiered consent approach to allow participants to decline data sharing while still participating in the study, and developing a script for an extended discussion of data sharing with participants, including a comprehension check where respondents would provide a definition of data sharing and revisiting each participant's consent at the end of the interview. Beyond the consent process, we have some recommendations around transparency and data sharing in qualitative research in general. So think about how to make qualitative research more transparent and able to be shared as early in the study as possible. So before you collect data, before you create your study tools, work with your ethics review committee to make sure they understand what you want to do with the data and how the data will be shared, and conduct mock and pilot interviews to gather feedback on how study participants may interpret your data sharing question. And then here's a list of some of the resources that we mentioned during the presentation. And yeah, thanks so much for your time, and feel free to reach out to any of us with questions.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm just going to go and make myself presenter. And Ali, do you want to have the first question?
Sure. So we have a question from Catherine about how do you handle data taken from social media? So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of those.
I can take a stab at starting with this one. I'm currently working on a project that's using some Reddit data, and the data use agreement that people click through when they use a lot of these social media platforms, says that this data is publicly available. So by using it, they're agreeing that people like us can come in and use the API or their own scripts to scrape that data and analyze it and publish on it. But of course, it doesn't feel as though it's truly ethical to completely take that at face value. So we are anonymizing the data by just changing a few words in any kind of presentation of the data that we'll give, so that it wouldn't be searchable, and otherwise applying the same principles of transparency and trying to create the same documentation that we've discussed for data products that are collected in interviewing and focus group type of more traditional settings.
There is a significant body of work on data sharing from social media data, more broadly speaking, and some of what Laurie mentioned are best practice. It also really depends upon the social media that you're talking about. The three mentioned aren't all alike. So the way we look at this as an archive is often kind of through the lens of reasonable expectations of privacy. So for example, something that's posted in a private Facebook group, we would consider that private information, and we would only think that's shareable if you get explicit permission from everyone who posted to that particular Facebook group. Twitter is much more public, as is Reddit. Still, especially for kind of lower level Twitter users, they probably don't expect their data to become part of a research data set or be quite as widely available. They think they're posting this to their 100 followers or so. And so there are trade-offs involved depending on the nature of the data, depending on the population that you're talking about. If you can reach out and get opt-in for data sharing, that's terrific. Otherwise, one thing that Twitter encourages people to do is not to share the actual data, but to compile a data set out of tweet IDs, which means that if people go back and are uncomfortable with their tweets, they can delete them. Otherwise, once you have the tweet IDs, you can do what's sometimes referred to as rehydrating the data and get back the full text of all the tweets, minus those that were deleted. Again, trade-offs, because some data might be gone. And so for politicians, for example, that might be particularly problematic. I'm a political scientist, but those are some of the issues that are worthwhile looking at.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to let everyone know I uploaded the wrong PDF, so now you have the full PDF with all the slides. So just make sure you download it again if you had the other one. So thank you. So here's a question, actually a couple from James. Do the checklist include things around the code books, themes, etc.? Could you share the detailed checklist, which I think you did some, and checklists for transparency? How do matrix shells look like or are used?
Okay, so hopefully, on the screen now you can go and get that checklist yourself and check it out and see all of the items that are on there. But to answer the question briefly, yeah, as Sebastian mentioned, when we were building this, the overlap with the qualitative data software, so wasn't there yet. So you couldn't just say, hey, here's my NVivo project. So we put on things like your node structure. And then what we put on were not themes as such, but so for instance, say we wanted to look at various aspects of people's access to sexual and reproductive health. We would explain the queries that we did in NVivo, which nodes they drew from, and then we would, if possible, plan to share those node reports. So the coded data in the exact reports that were used to feed into the analysis. And for us, what a matrix shell looks like, we might also share our what we call matrices, which is basically a spreadsheet that we use to organize and systematically analyze our coded data. That for each theme that we begin to identify within the data, within a certain domain, for instance, we would say what respondent ID we are drawing from, and then start to populate that spreadsheet with quotes from that respondent's transcript that were drawn from the query that we said we were looking at in order to explore this domain. So for us, this makes our data sort of traceable. In our paper, we would say, people said this about their access, to sexual and reproductive health care, and here are some quotes that are illustrating this theme that we identified. If we were able to make a deposit on a repository for this full project, you would be able to see our matrix where we had identified this theme and all of the illustrative quotes that we had put in to start to build that theme out. You would be able to see that those quotes came from these node reports, how we had classified and coded that data to begin with, and maybe you would even have been able to see the cleaned and de-identified transcripts that they came from. So it's providing a sort of a traceback mechanism to support our claims that we're making in our published research.
Great, thank you very much. And Ali, would you like to ask another question?
Yeah, from Stephen, you have discussed this a little bit before, but I think that Stephen jumped in a bit later. But can you talk a little bit more about the argument for sharing data, or so-called transparency, and the benefits of it to some people, including Stephen himself, are not always self-evident?
There's various components of the benefits of this, right? So one thing is kind of that it makes the research itself more robust. If I can check on, does the broader content of your transcripts actually support the excerpts that you picked, that makes me more confident that you're right, that I agree that your interpretation is maybe not, exactly reproducible, but is congruent with the data, makes sense in the context of the data. There are other broader benefits. One is that people may actually, and there are examples of that, use the transcripts in larger projects. So if someone else is interested in a different topic, they can pull transcripts shared from different topics that raised similar or even the same question and do much broader analysis. It's not the same type of analysis, right? It's slightly different if you haven't collected the data themselves. And I think all of us as qualitative researchers are aware of that. But it does open really interesting avenues for mid-scale, I would say, qualitative research. And then thirdly, there's an enormous benefit to pedagogy where data can be relatively easily shared. So that's probably not the case for GENS data, which are still somewhat sensitive, but a lot of qualitative data, once de-identified, are fairly harmless, and they're really, really terrific in the classroom.
Great, thank you very much. And here's a question. Again, typed, I hope I didn't miss it, so just in case, but sometimes people come in a little later. But for interviews, how do you handle redaction of audio video files rather than transcripts?
Rarely. So typically when you have most people who de-identify and who promise de-identification share transcripts. If you share videos, virtually all examples I know just have restricted access to the data and then share the full videos. So for example, there's a fantastic project called Databrary that shares child development psychology videos. And the way they handle this is that every researcher accessing data from Databrary has to run through their own IRB. So it's kind of an inter-IRB collaboration for access to the data because they're all identifiable. And they have an exemplary consent procedure where they explain to parents how that is going to happen and how that would work. So that would be, I think, the typical model. Sorry.
just something I would add to that is we've never intentionally recorded video of our interview or focus group respondents. However, for the last wave of data collection for the project that I mentioned, we were in the field in mid-March of 2020. So we had to quickly pivot from all in-person interviews where we were traveling through Iowa to doing these interviews over Zoom, where we quickly realized that Zoom would not allow you to just audio record. You had to record the video and the audio, and then they showed up as separate files, but there was no way to not record the video. So we had to quickly change all of our consent and introduction to let people know that this was happening, but that we would be deleting the video portion and only working with the audio transcript. So if it is not possible to go through the extensive process that Sebastian just described, even if video was intentionally a part of your project, maybe for thinking about sharing just to do the audio and transcript portion.
Yeah, just to add to, I don't know if I don't think I explicitly said or we explicitly said, but I think in a lot of the stuff that we haven't, everything we've been doing at Guttmacher and my study, like we delete the audio files, right? We just keep the transcripts. So in these situations, we don't have to go back and redact from the audio file because it's gone.
Great, thank you. Sarah's just mentioning, I just did an IRB that wanted me to record my interviews via Zoom, and the IRB wanted to ensure that I would delete and not use identified voice and visual. So like what you were just saying, so thank you. I do want to mention at the beginning of all the pandemic and COVID and where everyone was, like Lori just mentioned, trying to figure out what they do now. We did a series of webinars with researchers who their specialty is how to collect data online. And we did some with the SAGE authors too. So that's on our website under remote resources. So feel free, it's all free, but if you're still trying to figure out some of these ways of collecting data where you can't be in person, those are really good resources. So please check that out. So I just want to thank Lori, Jennifer, and Sebastian for a great presentation. And I just wanted to go through a few slides just to talk a little bit more about the community. So that this is just different, software you can use with NVivo, so you can go on our website and check that out. But we do have more webinars up and coming. So you can see here with the Qualitative Research and Innovation webinar series, feel free to register for the last two in this series. And then we also have culturally responsive research webinar series, and we have four more of those. So feel free; they're all complimentary. So please, if you're interested, register. I just also wanted to let you know we have a podcast, and I interview researchers about their research and how they collect data, how they analyze it. You can find it on all the major platforms there. And then please consider joining the community. At the end of this webinar, there's a short survey, and one question is, would you like to join the community? And basically, I just send an email to you and you can join, but the big benefits of the community are these types of thought leadership webinars, learning from people on the podcast, helping you connect with researchers, and we do have funding opportunities. We'll be announcing our early career researcher grant relatively soon too. So with that, I just wanted to thank all of you for joining us, and also thank Ali for working with me on these.
Yes, thanks, Stacy, and thanks everyone for joining and for the wonderful presentation. Just a quick mention from me that if you are looking for additional free resources just to help either teaching, learning, or researching online, SAGE also has a page via their main website that publishes open access COVID research, and in turn has resources to help support researchers during this time as well.
Thank you, Ali, for bringing that up too. And so just a little shout out, Stephen's giving to Guttmacher Institute for all the great work you do. So just wanted to share that with you, Lori and Jennifer. And so with that positive note, we'll just say bye and thank you to our panelists too.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.